Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. Today on our show, we are going to be talking about some breaking breaking news. For those of you who are part of the Church of God Anderson movement denomination, we are
Was it
information.
denomination that you said?
It was.
Okay. I just want to make sure you said denomination.
I did. So, the Church of God
Scott's in rare form this
Anderson.
morning.
I am. So the Church of God have put out information as they are now taking applicants, which I'm going to use that term very loosely, for the interim director. And just to kind of basically just kind of talk a little bit about, for those who may not know, our general director about a year ago said that he was resigning, and the Church of God board, who's in charge of overseeing trying to find the next general director, has been hosting monthly prayer meetings, have been in dialogue. They've been trying to. We've even had Jeanette Flynn on the show, who's been in those meetings, and also wrote a proposal to kind of have an interim director. That would be a good fit to have an interim director in between when Jim Lyons leaves and whoever the next person who's going to be the general director is in. Um, so with that being said, this is kind of like the next step where now they're taking nominations for the interim director. So Micah, when you got this email that kind of talks a little bit about all this stuff with the director and the information about the interim director, like what were kind of like your initial thoughts when you got this letter and you're opening up and you're reading everything inside and the job description and all that?
Well, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, sorry. I just
No, no,
dumped
no.
on you.
You've had more coffee than I have. So
That's true.
it's 8:30 on a Monday. So it's yeah. Anyway, um my initial thought was that, you know, there was kind of an abruptness to Jim announcing that he was going to retire from the general director role. And I think
Mm,
that correct me if I'm wrong, but the general director of the Church of God has a term of 7 years, I think. I think it's
mm-hmm.
7 years. And every 7 years, they can decide whether or not they want to stay on as general director or they can step down. And during that time, if they decide to seek, quote unquote, reelection, they go before the General Assembly of the Church of God, which is usually held at the national conference, and then they vote. And if they vote yes, that person can stay on for another term. So Jim, I believe, stayed on. He's in his second term, I believe.
Mm-hmm. He's in the second
Um,
term now.
and about a year and a half ago, I want to say,
Mm-hmm.
was when it was announced that he was going to be stepping down because he wanted to quote, I think he said retire. I think he wants to
Mm-hmm.
retire.
Yeah.
Um, now I've heard numerous stories, but I don't know that they're fact or not. But it's just, he is in fact finishing his second term of 7 years, and you know, as Scott said, there were numerous conversations, prayer meetings, search committee meetings on where and what and how and who was going to be the next general director of the Church of God. And my assumption was that, you know, maybe they would have found somebody by now, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
um, we get this. I got this email, and I think I forwarded it to Scott. I think last week,
Yeah, you
and
forwarded
it's
it to me, and then
literally,
I also got one, which I'm starting to get emails from the Church of God finally. So I also got the email too. So I was like surprised that I actually got the email.
you only had to spend 2 years in a UMC church to get a Church of God email, even though your credentials are in the Church of God still.
Yeah.
Um, but we get this email, and it's saying that we're going to hire an interim, and while that person is interim director, they are kind of going to oversee everything while the search committee still searches. Um, my thought immediately was that, oh, they don't have any idea what they want to do and they just want to kick it down the road, which I'm okay with because I'd rather them think long and hard before they jump into something that they regret, if that makes sense. Um, at the same time, it seems like a long time ago that Jim announced that he was going to be stepping down. And so it's as much as I'm appreciating the fact in my older age that they're taking their time with this, I also work in a space and have friends and colleagues that work in spaces where turnover is high and you need to fill a position pretty quickly, and they do.
Yeah.
Um, so it's pretty interesting to me. Like you and I've had conversations over the couple of years that we've been doing this podcast together that like, how many years do churches sit empty? Because with and what I mean by that is with pastors or without pastors that have left a church and the church gets a search committee or a pulpit committee or whatever you want to call it, and they take 2 years, 3 years, sometimes even more to fill the lead pastor position. And my question for you, Scott, is how is this any different?
And well, and here's the thing. That's a great question. Before I answer that question, there's something you said about, the idea that we thought that they're going to have a director right now, that we're going to go right to director. And I think that was kind of the thing when we had Jeanette on our show, where she was talking about when she was talking about interims and the importance role of interims, and even trying to write a proposal to get an interim director. And even that, because that was like what, January when we had that conversation with her,
Yeah, and
and
it's
just her and her
September.
trying, and it's September. So I mean, so it kind of goes without saying. And again, I don't know how often this committee's meeting to talk about the general director, interim director, this whole search process. Like, I don't know. Like, it could be like bi-monthly, it could be every month, bi-monthly, every quarter. Like, we don't know. But the fact that we knew that Jeanette was going to propose this back in January and was writing it, and even gave us a copy of kind of a rough draft of what she was going to propose. And the fact that it's now September and they're now deciding, hey, let's go with the interim director thing, really shows it shows a couple of things. First, I think they're taking their time because they want to make sure they're doing everything right and making sure that they really find the person that's going to be the next general director. So I think in that way, I respect that. But like Micah, you said, you work in a institution where when someone leaves, the role is immediately filled because it's a high prestigious, it's not like like even here, like if we have a custodian that leaves the church, Pastor Colleen's putting the job search out there, getting interviews, getting stuff to fill that role. Because if we don't have a custodian, then that means the responsibility of the custodian work now lays upon the staff. And if the staff has other responsibilities they have to do, cleaning is another one that's added onto their already full plate of everything they have to do during a work week. So
Mhm.
if we look at kind of just structures, and I think that's one thing I find interesting about the interim director is that one of the responsibilities that they're trying to do is they're trying to see what are some of the blind spots within the structure, the operating structure of the Church of God that needs to be addressed. Are there things that are within the thing that are not working well? And I mean, and as someone who's, again, getting my doctorate in transformative leadership, really focusing on transitions, like leadership transitions within churches and organizations. That's like what my big doctoral project's on. Like for me, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, there's some stuff that I think is great, but already I'm reading through this. I'm like, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem. Like immediately, I'm seeing problems just within the list of just trying to get the interim director and just some of the goals that they're trying to do. Like I'm like, this is an issue.
Well, let me ask you
And
this real quick before we get
yes.
into it. So, like, in most cases, an interim is just putting a body in place until you figure it out. Is that fair?
I think
And the
kind of.
reason the reason I say that is that a lot of times when you hire an interim, whether it's a pastor, like, uh, you know, well, in this case, for the context of this podcast, like interim pastor, for example, like they can come in, preach the word of God, hold office hours, keep the church stable until they hire the next pastor. They don't really make a lot of the business decisions. And I'm thinking though, with this being such a high position within the Church of God denomination, that it's, can that person make decisions? I guess is what I'm asking. Can that person, once they're hired and in place, are they going to be able to make said decisions, or are they just going to be a placeholder until they actually hire the real thing?
Well, let me counter with another question. Did you feel like the general director was in a position to make decisions, or did everything have to be approved by the GA?
Or are they going to be approved by the GA?
So, so if your top
So it's kind of
now,
null and void then. My I guess I answered my question because it's kind of
yeah,
null and
yeah, well,
void.
yeah. I mean, well, and I mean, I'm reading the language, and even though you could read this language and like this position will involve assessing current challenge. Let me just read the position summary, and let's talk about like if they have actually any power to change based on this position summary. The interim director will play a critical role in working with leaders and organizations across the movement, utilizing task force and building representative teams that are able to assist in reviewing and evaluating the entirety of our organization structure, governance, and operational processes. This position will involve assessing current challenges, striving to develop and strengthen cooperative and united solutions, addressing unclear structures, identifying any apparent lack of authority that causes a failure in fulfilling the mission, grappling with issues concerning centralized versus decentralized leadership, most effective minister council consistency, and other concerns that hinder organizational equity, relationships, and missional effectiveness. This role is expected to be completed within 12 to 24 months. So, me looking at the language, you're evaluating, you are identifying, you have the responsibility in assisting and in reviewing and evaluating. You are utilizing task force and building representation teams. So really, if I'm reading this based on the verbiage and the language that they're using, my job is to see, like, not my job, but the interim director's job. Please do not nominate me. The interim director's job is simply to look, get a fresh set of eyes, look at the organization, point out to the leadership teams, here are some of the problems. Here's my report. Here's the problems I see. Maybe the only power they do have is to build teams to assess in reviewing and evaluating. So I'm going to build. So the only power I have is to pick people, whether I could say I want you, and that's the power I have, or here's the team I want to help review. GA vote on it. Do you approve this team? Like, I mean, that's kind of going, that's a little gray area. But basically, the only power I have is basically for me to look at everything, write a report, and say, these are the things that I find that you need to change within your structures to fulfill your mission as the Church of God Anderson. If you desire to be a spiritually healthy, missionally focused organization dedicated to uniting, equipping, and empowering leaders and congregations to expand the kingdom of God, if that is your desire, and if I'm the interim director and I hand in this report saying, if this is your desire, these are the things that need to change, I'm just writing a report. I don't have the power to make those changes. And if we
Well,
look at
some would argue that what's the point of this role then?
well, it goes back
It,
to, well, I think it goes back to what Jeanette said back in January about the role of interim. Like, you mentioned that the interim is like kind of like a placeholder for the next general director. The interim, especially the way I understand interims based from the conversation we had with Jeanette and then just the sources I'm reading for my doctorate program, an interim is basically there to not only fill a void when there is a vacancy in a leadership position, but they're also there to help with any type of healing process that may have happened if there is a bad thing, or there may be, or they have the thing to say, hey, here's some of the things I'm seeing. These are some of the things that you may want to change structurally, culturally, before the next person arrives. So that when the next person arrives, they don't have to go and look at everything and go, okay, here's the problems that need to be fixed. Like the director can come in and actually start doing what they need to do, which is push the movement forward or push the denomination forward or push the church forward instead of, okay, I'm in and in my first year I now have to deal with like a lot of challenges and issues from the last pastor. So my hope is that the reason why we have the interim director is that they're going to kind of not only be a placeholder but also kind of help the structure, the organization structure at the Hope, and even the governing board to basically look at this and say, okay, here are some of the things that need to change. Here's some of the things that you need to change if you want to fulfill your mission and your goal and your vision. Now, I think as the interim director, especially at this role, I don't think it'd be fair for you to say, okay, we're going to make this change, and have the power to do that. Mainly because usually the general director, again, in a normal business, usually whoever's the top CEO or the general director, they're the ones who got to make that decision, not the in-between person. They're just there to assess everything, say, hey, maybe we need to make these changes. Maybe we need to make these changes structure within the ministry council or the governing board or the search team, and then go from there. But yeah, I think so. That's kind of the hard part because I see from a normal structure of how a business should run, how a nonprofit should run, this doesn't seem like a bad idea. However, I also know how the Church of God is structured and how it runs. And I'm kind of understanding your point. Like, what's the point of having an interim director if they don't have any power to make any type of change, which is kind of what the general director, they don't have power. Everything's approved by
Yeah,
the
that's what I
General
was saying.
Assembly.
Like, what's the point of the general director and what's the point of the interim? Like, either or. You could look at it either way. Like, they're going to have to like collaborate with the board, whether it's the ministry council, the GA, um, which not to get into a long discussion about theology or philosophical beliefs, but like we've joked for how long about the Church of God being a denomination versus a movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, it's set up awful strange to be considered such.
Well,
Um,
it's like what my pastor said. I've said this before in earlier episodes. Like a movement's just another word for weak denomination.
yeah. Well, and what I mean by that is that like if you look at the structure, right? Like every church under the umbrella of the Church of God, or has Church of God or First Church of God on its sign or door, you know, wherever it is in this country, they all have their own boards. They all have their own pastors. They all have their own staffs. They all make their own individual decisions. And the only time where you get involved with national leadership is when you get together for GA. And that happens every other year. And not everybody goes to it because of location, money, whatever. And we've had conversations about that as well.
Yeah.
Um, Something that I'm interested in, um, as we're looking through this, two things that kind of jump off the page to me is somebody who's been applying for jobs recently and somebody who's been um, just recently graduated and things like that. One of the things I noticed about this job uh, uh, description is under the qualifications, there's nothing about education.
Yeah, ain't that interesting?
And it's like, well, do you want a PhD? Do you want a master's degree? Do you want a PhD or master's degree from a seminary? Does that seminary need to be Church of God? Can it be Asbury? Can it be, you know, Fuller? I don't know.
Well,
Like I'm
and I mean, really, when you look at the qualifications, you need to have a biblically strong, committed Wesleyan holiness teaching truths. And that's a mouthful. And gifted communicator who builds united teams across a diverse organization for a common mission. So, okay. So at least they have to have some understanding, or at least have to be somewhat within the Wesleyan camp. But then they also have to, there was something here too that they had to, it's not in qualifications, but there's another part. Maybe it's under key responsibilities where they have to have an understanding, a general understanding of the day-to-day, or gain understanding, but something that they had to understand, at least the Church of God. I felt like I read that somewhere, but I can't seem to find it now within all the words. But I remember, clear evidence of a historical understanding of the movement's relational and organizational models. So, but that's just the models. Like, you don't really have to have a understanding of the history of the Church of God. You just have to understand the movement's relational and organizational models. Like, how is it structured? If you can understand how the Church of God is structured, then you're pretty good with that. Now, but yeah, and I mean, we've talked a little bit about, like, as a pastor, like sometimes when we see churches that say, okay, we're hiring a pastor, but you must have a PhD, like you're kind of like,
really.
I think that's a little overqualification. Plus, if you're saying we want a PhD, but we're only going to pay you $20,000 a year, like if you have a PhD, they could probably get like a teaching job at a university and make a lot more money and have more security of supporting their family than pastoring a church out in the middle of nowhere. You know what I mean? Like, so I think just that it's keeping it open, because again, and I think the reason why they're keeping it open is because the way this interim director is going to even be considered is they have to be nominated by somebody.
Yeah.
Which is, again, another weird thing. Like, this is a pretty high position, and you're leaving it up to just regular Church of God pastors and lay leaders to basically recommend somebody. You know, they're going to write a name and they're going to put it in a hat and say, okay, here's who we want as our interim director.
Well, the first thing I thought was interesting was there's no education, right?
Yeah, no education.
And then the second thing was the compensation. This is the interim director salary will be established through the negotiations between the ministry council and the candidate for interim director position. In most cases, in jobs that I've applied for or have considered applying, there's at least a starting salary and what they're willing to go to.
I'm
And
gonna I'm gonna get in trouble by saying this.
okay,
I'm gonna get in trouble
who,
by saying this.
who's gonna
This
get who you gonna get in trouble by?
uh I'm probably gonna tick off a lot of people within the Church of God with this statement, maybe.
Okay,
This description literally looks like a description of a church that literally is a small dying church. Because anytime when I've looked at like bigger churches, like especially back in Ministry Connector, Atlas, or even when I'm like, what's the church, like even with the Church of God searches that I have looked for Church of God jobs over the years, if it's a bigger church like a Refugee Road Church of God, or if it was a bigger church like a Fairfax Community Church or a Chartel, when you look at compensation, they will tell you a starting salary, $40,000, $50,000, $30,000, especially if it's full time, right? They will put, if it's bivocational and they'll say, well, we have to work it out. I understand that. But the fact that this is a full-time salaried position, generally requiring 40 or more hours per week. And this is a position that could be fulfilled working remotely, but will require regular visits to the national office. But you are now doing a compensation and you're basically saying the salary has to be negotiated. I don't know who, any person who may have a skill set that can really actually do good in this position is not going to take this position, because
Well,
it's
like
like,
what if you live in Utah and you want to be in this position and you have to go to Anderson?
you have to go to Anderson and you have to fly. And that's the thing is that coming out of my compensation like every other minister? Like healthcare comes out of my compensation, comes out of my
Well,
pastoral package. Like this doesn't, to me, this is insulting.
later on it said, well, in that same paragraph, working location, it says travel expenses will be budgeted, but it really doesn't say anything more than that.
And again, I don't know if they wrote that in there because they didn't get approval from the GA on what the starting salary should be for the interim director. So that's their way of saying, we're going to negotiate it because we can't really put a price out there because it hasn't been approved by GA. Which I mean, I don't know if someone who's on the ministry council, if you want to anonymously send me a tip and say, yeah, that's kind of what it is, this is why we did it, then that's a problem. If I'm the interim director, I'm saying, okay, for a high position like this, and you can't even give a good salary, you have to be vague about salary because it can't get approved by the General Assembly because you only meet once a year. Like to
Once every other
me,
year.
once every other year, like to me, that's why you guys are in a, I'm going to stop, but that's why you guys are in a mess that you are right now. Because you are so unhealthy and so unorganized that you have to allow, you can't even strongly say, we're going to offer this roles for $80,000 plus we're going to pay any type of traveling cost for you to do this job for at least 12 to 24 months. If that was written out, and let's say I was somebody who maybe is a retired pastor, or maybe I'm somebody who's been working in the church long enough, and I say, I really love my movement. I really care about this movement. I'll be willing to sacrifice 2 years of my life, not have a regular pastoral job, and take 2 years to really help my movement do this because I feel like that I'll be fairly compensated. I feel like this would be a good fit for my family. And I also feel like that I can really that I have the qualifications to really do this. So, and I don't know if you can self-nominate, and that's a whole other issue. But if this wasn't for nomination, if this was like we're now taking applications, I would send my application. I'm not sending my application with a compensating that says this is going to be done through negotiations. Because to me, that means like, oh, I'm really passionate and I'm really good. And then I go there and they go, okay, we're going to offer you $30,000. Or we're going to offer you your salary based on how close you are to Anderson. So if you live right in Indianapolis, guess what? We're gonna maybe we'll pay you a little bit more because your travel's going to be less. But if you're really good, we think you would be really great. You live out in California. We're going to give you a salary that's a little bit less because we're going to be paying more in your travel. Which I think some people are like, that's fair, but at the same time, it's like, well, if I have to, pay my bills, feed my family, pay the high cost of living in California, and you're only going to give me a salary of $20,000 because most of it's going to go into my travel, then I'm not going to take this position. So
Let me ask
in a
you
way,
this.
okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, let's just say I'm a lead pastor at a church and I've been nominated to be this general director. Am I going to do both, or am I going to resign my church and then walk away from my church, and then in 2 years when my job's up, I'll be jobless?
Well, that's another good question, because if you look at the lifestyle and work standards, when you look in work, the pursuit of excellence, faithfulness, and timeliness is anticipated. The job is fluid in nature, but set hours are not required, but accessibility during normal business hours is compulsory. So if I'm like, so let's say if I'm a pastor, I'm full-time pastor, and I go, hey, I want to do this, and it's a full-time position, and I'm looking at it and I go, you know what? This might actually be something that may work. But then let's say I get a call from, let's say, Global Strategies that I need to talk to, I need to talk to Andrew Gale right now because, or he's calling me because he needs to ask me as an interim about some structural needs. And I can't answer that phone call because I'm praying with a family who their loved one's dying. I guess I'm not accessible during normal business hours. Plus, the fact is, normal business hours, what is that? Because I feel like, especially in ministry, depending on what people do, and especially in our culture today, like there's no such thing as normal business hours. For some people, normal business hours may be I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I start working at 6 o'clock, I'm done by 2. But if everyone else works 9 to 5, if someone's calling me at 4 o'clock and I'm not answering, and they're getting mad because I'm not accessible during normal business hours, well, those aren't my business hours. Because again, ministry is a little bit more fluid. So if I'm going to be reached during normal business hours from like 9 to 5, and that's the other thing, like when you think about all the various ministries within the Church of God, you probably have some ministries that may be in a different time zone. Some ministries that are international that you may be. So the fact is like if there's missionaries, if there's a mission, a Church of God missions that's made up of a network of missionaries in Europe, their normal business hours are going to look very different than American business hours. So if they're calling at like, I don't know, like 3 o'clock their time, it's already 8 in the evening my time. So I'm not answering that phone call. I'm going to spend time with my family. I may be seeing my child's recital or my son's basketball game. Like, so I feel like if the interim comes in, they're going to have to clearly define these are my normal business. Who's setting up the normal business hours? Is it the Church of God or is it the interim? Because if it's the interim, depending on who you get, their hours may be different, especially if they work if they're working remotely from California.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's kind of another missing part of the puzzle. I feel like we've kind of hit like a lot of the main issues that I have, but the whole, again, I feel like the whole nominating of this interim director is just goofy.
Yeah.
Because I mean, and I understand that a lot of times, like in other roles, this is done. Like I know it was done when Jim took the general director, like there's nominations. And I believe someone actually nominated me, which I'm like, why would you do that? Like, I'm not going to get it because I know nothing about what happens in the upper organization of the Church of God. But the other thing that I find kind of confusing about this whole interim search is that the other issue with an interim is a lot of times within churches, and again, since this is looking much like a very stereotypical like church job description, the fact that let's say you get someone who's really good, they're very good interim, they're very good, and you're going, man, this person would be perfect as our general director. Guess what? They're not eligible. They're not eligible. Now, maybe that's why they're doing the 12 or 24 months, because if they're like, man, this person's really good, after the end of 24 months, we're going to have a season of time where we're just going to kind of gather all the general director search. And if that person puts their name to be the general director, then that's going to be a solid in. And luckily it
Are they
doesn't
allowed to do that?
Well, here's the thing. According to this technically, here's the thing. Historically, no. But the way this is written, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say if you are the interim director, you cannot be nominated or even considered for the general director position. So the fact that if you get someone who's really good and you think, man, this person would be a fantastic general director, guess what? If we're looking historically, that's not going to be happening. But based on the wording throughout this thing, I have not once read anywhere in this job description or even in the email that Esther and Ephraim sent out. Like everything I'm reading here does not say that the interim director cannot be nominated for the general director when they actually do open up searches for the general director. So that's still on the table. So again, historically, you can't do it, but based on the wording of this job description, it does not say that. So I think, if anything, I think the ministry council and the search committee chair of the general director search team need to make that clear. If whoever is being nominated and accepts this interim position, that they can or they cannot be considered as the general director, because it does not say that. And I believe that's going to kind of make things very interesting, because I think, and here's my opinion, if you want my honest opinion, if somebody takes a position and they have the good qualifications to be the interim general director and they do a good job, I really do not see why they cannot be not at least even considered to be the general director.
That's a great point.
Because if you see they have great communication skills, they really are understanding, they're really organizing teams, they're doing a great job, they're really finding the weaknesses. They're finding the weaknesses within our structure, but yet they're kind of keeping the integrity of the historical relationship and organization of the movement that we've had since the beginning. If you have someone who's really good and really fits this description to a T, and you think, man, this person would be perfect as our general director, I really don't see why not. You can't make that jump. I always, and again, I understand like within churches why they don't do it, because churches are more relational. So even if you have an interim there and then you have a new pastor that comes in, maybe the church might say like, well, we want to keep the interim because we're really good and they really care for us. I'm like, well, no, because then that influences the decision. It's not spirit led, it's relational led. I get that. And I know, but when you move up in a high structure like the Church of God national offices, relationships are important, but very rarely are you going to see the general director build deep relationships with local churches. Occasionally it does happen, but really their primary role is to build relationships within the organizational structures that keep the ship running smoothly. And that's your primary focus. So if you have somebody who's really good at organizing teams and building relationships and empowering them to fulfill the mission and the values of the Church of God, then I really think that they should also be considered. Because again, it's a higher up position and it's a whole different responsibility versus being a pastor of a local congregation.
Yeah. I think too that so recently the office that I work in a dean's office, and we went through a transition where our dean became the provost of the university, and the associate dean assumed the role of interim,
Mm-hmm.
and they did a national search, and it took a year and a half, 2 years for us to find a new dean, and the new dean just started this past July. So all that to say, they offered the guy who was the interim dean the job. Basically, if he wanted to apply for it, he could have very much done so. The only qualifications in higher ed world is that you have a terminal degree.
Mm-hmm.
So He, in fact, had a terminal degree in his field, and the college was, his master's is in architecture and interior design. Um, Architecture falls under our purview, so ideally he could have done that. But at the same time, he realized that I've been in education, higher ed for 30 years. I've done my time. I've been associate dean. I've been chair. I've been an interim dean. I don't need to do this. And so, all that to say that like the structure is set up as such where there are, you know, quote unquote, you know, expectations and or rules and or expectations in respect to the job itself. So like you have to have a terminal degree, you have to have experience, you have to um, know what you're getting into, and it's a lot more specific, I think, than what we're looking at with this job description. And I guess finally what I would ask you is, what is your hope or for the outcome of this? Like what do you think is going to happen, and what is your hope?
Well, I think my hope, that's a good question. I think my hope in all of this is, again, going back to the ministry description, my hope is that they're able to do at least what based on what their desire is, that the Church of God Ministries wants to be a spiritually healthy, missionally and focused organization dedicated to uniting, equipping, empowering leaders and congregations to expand the kingdom of God. I think that alone is a very good statement. And my hope is that with the interim director, they're able to kind of point out the holes in the ship that's taken on water, saying, here's what needs to be patched up. Here's some of the changes you need to change out. Here's some of the things that need to get changed out to make this ship run a little bit better, a little bit stronger, a little bit smoother. And that when you, and again, my second hope is this, because I know sometimes with a lot of churches, you hire a pastor because you want all these changes to happen. And then the pastor comes and they say, here's the recommendations I have for all these changes to happen. And basically they say, no, we're not doing that. Or that
Right.
doesn't fit with our, and I think that's going to be kind of the thing. Like if this is someone who is in a position that fits all the responsibilities and the qualifications to do this job well, and they are doing it well, and they say, here's my list of recommendations that you need to do to make these changes, and they say, nope, the ministry council says, nope, we're not going to do that, or we may do this, but we're not going to do all this stuff, then really, I think at that point, you're kind of at a point where you really just,
You're being a
again,
placeholder.
you're basically considered a placeholder or at least a figurehead for the movement for a year or two until they can figure out who their general director is going to be. And not only that, but then you just really render this position a very useless position that you're going to be paying. Well, we don't know how much you're going to be paying this person. So you're going to be at least paying this person something. So for me, I feel like that's a waste of your resources and a waste to bring someone in and you're not going to take any of their changes or suggestions seriously. Or even if you do have some, or even if the ministry council's like, well, that's not how we do things in the Church of God because we do it this way, at least be able to say, okay, well, what can we do to kind of find that middle ground? What can we do to really figure out what's going to work for both parties, where you can still kind of keep your traditions and your historical organization style in place, but we're going to add a fresh coat of paint to make it look a little bit better. So we're going to have to make a little bit of changes here so that both walk away happy. And I think that's going to be my hope, is that whoever is nominated in this position will be able to do something, because really all the stuff I've read about interims in my research, interims are only as good or as influential for 6 to 8 months.
Mm.
within local churches, because after that, that's when you start to see a drop in attendance, a drop in giving, a drop in ministry. You start to see that drop.
Which is interesting with how long it takes to fill a pulpit.
Oh yeah, which is no wonder why a lot of churches within the Church of God are kind of in a dismissible state, because, and it's not the fault of the interim, because the interim's doing there. It's just, this is what we see historically. This is what we see across all churches, across all denominations. So, and again, an interim director is mainly, their main goal is to do healing. So,
Yeah.
and I mean, we went through a very, I think a lot of churches and a lot of religious organizational structures went through a very rough time through, I don't want to say COVID, because I don't think that was the main issue, but I think just a very rough time, both politically polarization, racially charged time within the last couple of years. And I believe those two things kind of help drive a split or a wedge in the Church of God. So having someone who has a proven track record for working with diverse entities, and I think, and if I'm going to read into that, based on everything I have witnessed within the Church of God for the last 5 years, it's not just race or international or that. I think that's also political diverse entities too. I think that's going to be, and I think that's going to be kind of a big thing. Like, can you work with people who are diverse racially, politically, etc., and try to bring that healing to this already fractured movement because of these things? And I think that's going to be kind of a big, it's going to be a big undertaking for whoever's the interim of the Church of God national offices.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to do that job.
I mean, I'll tell you what. I mean, I wouldn't mind doing this job if it was like 5 years ago. I wouldn't mind doing this at all. And again, I wouldn't have any qualifications 5 years ago because I wasn't working on my doctorate at that point in transformative leadership. So I wouldn't have been considered anyway. But if I did have, like, again, if I had all that credentials and I had all that knowledge 5 years ago, I would easily take this on. Now, so much, I don't know if I would, because I mean, it's a big ask, and especially if this is a full-time salaried position, and I'd still want to keep my role at the church I'm working at now. Um, that's going to be a lot of work. I wouldn't be able to do 40 hours of work and do 40 hours of work with my other job. I would be burned out very quickly. Um, so yeah, I'm going to have to say I would not want this role. And sure enough, I'm sure a bunch of people listen to this podcast will throw my name in the hat to nominate me, just because they just want to see what I would do if I actually did get the call, which I know I will not. So
That's what I'm doing as soon as we hang up this call.
oh my gosh, no. I'm nominating you, Micah. You're getting nominated from me. I'm sitting it right now. Click, type, type.
I'm not at a state where I should be responsible for the outcome of
Oh, yeah.
the church nationally.
No.
So.
Yeah. All right. Well, friends, let us know what you think. If you're part of the Church of God and you've read this report, are some of the concerns or some of the things you're seeing the same thing that Micah and I are seeing? Maybe you have a whole different take on it. Maybe you think that, oh, no, this is correct. This is good. And if you're someone from the Ministers Council or the Search Team Council and you're listening to this, feel free to send us an email at our website, thescottstedman.com. You can just email us. We'll get your email, and we definitely will read it. We won't read it on air, especially if you're kind of clarifying some stuff. But anything that you're trying to clarify, especially the writing of this, would be very helpful as we kind of understand a little bit of your thought process. And some of the questions that Mike and I have about this interim director. So friends, thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been informative. I hope this has been helpful, and we'll be back on next week with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.